Wow. How to thrive in an ever-changing rental market is the topic of our show today. I'm Ken Decker.
I'm Ryan Decker.
And what we've decided is that there's been a number of changes in the Tenant Act.
Yep.
And there's been a number of changes in the market in Ottawa as far as how much rental property is available. It's a very hot market for landlords, very tough for tenants. So, what are some of the major changes? I think.
And there's also some legal changes coming through in the government.
With marijuana,
and that's going to affect tenants as well and landlords. So they've already preemptively made the rule changes for when that comes through.
Okay. So one of the biggest questions I get from tenants, and from landlords, both, is how much can they raise the rent?
Right.
And one of the changes that they've done, there used to be some caveats that there were certain types of properties that were exempt from the rental cap of increasing.
So you could increase it to rental markets
at any time.
At any time.
Yes.
Once a year.
Yes. And now those are gone. They've taken away those allowances. And so all properties now are subject to the rental cap.
Increase cap.
Yep. And for 2019, that's 1.8%.
Okay.
Now, sometimes landlords say, well, it's only 1.8%. I'm not going to increase it. Mm-hmm. That might be a mistake. First of all, they go, well, they're a good tenant, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't want to increase it because they might leave. Mm-hmm. Understanding that the rental market's gone up significantly in the last year, the odds of you increasing at 1.8% and them leaving are
very slim.
Very, very slim. Because they're probably going to have to go out and spend $100 a month more at another property.
And if they did leave because of that, you'd be able to increase your rent even higher than that 1.8% and probably get an equivalent or better tenant.
So as soon as the tenant moves, you're open to put your rental up at market rent.
Yes. So what we're saying is the increase cap is only if your tenant stays. If it's a new tenant, it's a new rent. You don't have to stick to the old rent.
Right. And the same rule applies. You're allowed to increase the rent once per year. And what we've found is when we go to sell investment properties for people, sometimes they haven't been doing the increases, and so they're far below market rent. That makes it very difficult to sell that property because there's rules in effect, like sell it to another investor, because there's rules in effect that landlords can't kick out their tenants. And so unless you're going to own or occupy it, that really limits who we can sell a investment property to. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
So what are some of the ways we could get around that?
Get around the market? I don't know if
we can't get around the law. We can't get around the law. Although I did have a landlord say to me the other day, I'm going to bribe's a nice word, but I'm going to pay them a certain amount of money to leave if they'd like to. So in other words, he's not evicting them. He's saying, he's
rewarding them.
Here's 2-3 months rent, whatever. Would you like to go find somewhere else to live? This is a bonus for ending your tenancy. Now, they can choose to stay or they can choose to leave. What he figures is if they choose to leave because he's significantly under market, he's going to recoup that 3 months rent very quickly by bringing a new tenant at the higher rent.
And he's also going to increase his saleable value.
Absolutely. Really increases saleable value because it's a factor of the amount of income that a property's receiving. Exactly.
Awesome. So we talked a little bit at the beginning that it's a hot market.
Yes.
And what we mean by that is there's not a ton for rent right now, and there's a lot of people wanting to rent. And so it becomes very easy for a landlord. They put their house up for rent and they get 30 applicants. They pick their favorite 3. They do credit checks, and then they choose their final candidate. And I wouldn't actually do credit checks on 3 all at the same time. I would start with 1, my favorite, and if he's great, then I'd take him. I wouldn't waste my money and time.
Yeah, and more landlords are requiring the tenant to bring their credit
Right.
check, and then the one they want to verify, they run another check on them.
Okay.
So that it's not a high cost to filter through people. Yeah. Also, the credit application generally will show like where they're working, how much money they're making, and who their references are, and that can help filter who you might want to rent to.
So because it's hot, the landlords can ask for more from the potential tenants.
More in what way?
Meaning they can ask, because in the past, you wouldn't normally, that wasn't the common, to ask for the tenant to do their own credit check.
Oh, yes.
Right? But now because it's so hot, there's certain things a landlord can be entitled to because,
Yeah, and it's good for a tenant to do it, actually, a prospective tenant, because if the landlord rejects them and they go to another place and the landlord does another credit check and they get rejected, it starts showing up on their bureau. Whereas if you can do your own credit check for free on your own self, and it doesn't affect your credit bureau that there's been an inquiry. So it's good, and then they can actually pass that along with the application. And if you really want to get, as a tenant, if you're listening to the show and you're going, well, they're telling all the things for the landlord, well, let's give a couple gems for the tenant.
Okay.
As if you can come prepared with your application with letters from your employer, verifying your employment, verifying how long you've worked there, that you're either permanent or whether it's contract or whatever, so that you've got that. Be prepared to present the best case. Now, for some tenants, your credit might be bruised, right? You might have poor credit. And we've had cases where, a person goes through a divorce, their credit's bruised during the divorce. Now they're on their own, they've got a good job, but they're having a heck of a time trying to get a landlord to accept them, because the landlords basically have the pick of the litter, so to speak. So they're picking the best credit bureaus. So I've come up with a couple ideas for tenants to suggest, because many times they say, well, I'll give you 3 months deposit, or I'll pay you a year up front, because they've got a settlement from their divorce now. They've got money, they just don't have credit, or good credit. So there are ways, because unfortunately the landlord can accept your 1 year payment in advance. But if you go to the rental tribunal and you say, hey, I gave him a year's advance, but I really only wanted to give him 1 month's deposit, the tribunal will force the landlord to pay all that money back. So it's dangerous for a landlord to do that. Now, I haven't verified this with the rental tribunal, so I might get in trouble here, folks. So if you think of doing this, you might want to just check first. But my idea is, when I rented my first commercial lease space, I had no history. That was 15 years ago. I had no history of my ability to pay rent, other than, my personal covenant, but no commercial history. And they didn't want to rent to me with just 1 month's rental payment in the bank, kind of, so to speak. So what they did was they had me give a letter of credit. So I go to the bank, and in that case it was $50,000. I put $50,000 in a GIC at the bank that I can never touch, because the bank issues a letter of credit to the landlord saying, if he defaults on his rent, you can take the payment from the $50,000. So each payment would come out of the $50,000 if I hadn't paid on time. That protects the landlord, but the tenant still has the money, and I get the interest off of the GIC because it's my money. I just can't cash the GIC until that agreement is done. So that might be a way, if people have a lot of money, they can do that.
Cool. So another thing that we've been finding is we had this family that was a refugee family coming over to Canada. And obviously they have no credit history in Canada. They have no credit. Financially, they're probably getting some support to be here. So it's a matter of, what landlord is going to want to take that responsibility. And so the people who were sponsoring them to come over to Canada decided that they were willing to co-sign. And so because they were willing to co-sign, the landlord was excited to be able to help, these refugees come into Canada and find a great place to stay, which is their unit, and but still have the security of if something goes wrong, it's covered for by their co-signer, who's a Canadian with great credit.
And that's a beautiful story, actually. I think we should expand on that story.
Okay.
Because that client of ours was actually, the landlord was our client, and the
person
tenant
looking
was our client.
Yeah.
Or the tenant's sponsor was our client.
The refugee sponsor was our
yes.
client. Yeah.
Yes. And we didn't know that match was going to be made when I started working with the investor. And the investor she was a single mom, never invested before, but really wanted to, and many times got to sort of the edge of the precipice or the cliff, so to speak, and didn't want to jump off, didn't feel prepared, got concerned that she wouldn't know what to do. All the worries, the negative chatter, all of that went running in her head, even though she had been pre-approved by the mortgage broker to buy an investment. Then she came and saw yours truly. I walked her through it. She read my book, The Wealth Formula.
Which, if you haven't read it, just side note, read it. If you don't have a copy of it, call us or email us and we'll get you a copy, because it's life-changing. And it was for her as well. Sorry, continue.
Thanks. And you can get it on Kindle too if you want.
Awesome.
You can come and get it at one of our offices, or you can get it on Kindle. And then after a consultation, a free consultation, I taught her different methods, why investing was a valuable asset to her for building wealth. She wanted to build wealth for her children. And she finally decided, hey, you know what? Okay, Ken, if you'll walk me through all the steps, then I'll do it. Knees knocking, teeth chattering, I'll do it with you. And I said, okay, let's walk this path. And if you decide not to buy, that's okay too. But let's walk the path. And we started seeing some properties, and it's a hot seller's market also for the kind of that 300 range. It's where she wanted to buy her investment property. And it's very hot. We went to see 3 properties. One was a no-go. We did not want to buy it. 2 we wanted to buy. Both of them had multiple offers on them. So a property came up that I felt was very strong. We went and saw it right away, put in an offer. She got it. Now, the closing was about 2 months long.
I thought it was quicker than that.
Maybe it was a little quicker.
Okay.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
It was fairly quick. But what I got was authorization to show the property, and well, not really show it, but put it on the market and use their pictures. So I was able to use the seller's pictures because the property was vacant. We got it on the market, and we rented it actually without even a showing. Yeah, I think your client actually looked in the windows.
Yes, we did go creep the windows.
So the property was vacant.
It was vacant, and we had set showings for the next Monday. And I called up my client and said, so we've got this great rental property coming up. Basically, we want to get you in there, but then you'll have to see it with everyone else. And then there's probably going to be lots of offers and rent to go through. So do you want to get in there? Or I can't get you in, but you want to see it. He said, yes. So we went, he looked through the windows. He decided, yes, this is something that would work. Let's rent it. So we did the application that night, and we had it rented. So it was purchased, but it hadn't closed yet.
Right.
It hadn't been seen yet, but it was rented. And it was rented for their desired rent.
Yeah, and we actually set the rent probably $50 below market.
Which is something we sometimes do.
To attract the best tenant.
The best tenant. Now, in this market, because it's still getting hotter and hotter since the story happened, that may not be necessary.
Right, you
to
could
get
probably
the best
put
tenant.
it at market rent.
Right.
And still get the best tenant. So what happened then was she closed on the property a few weeks later, and the lease started within about a week of her closing.
She had time to clean, and then it was... Move-in day. That's it.
which is awesome for a landlord. What better thing than know that you can buy a property and rent it before you close on it, and they move in slightly after you close on it, so you don't have that period where you start looking for a tenant after you've already closed on it. You might have a month or two vacancy,
and
which
that's
costs
something
money.
we've done for our clients for many years now, is making sure that we get a tenant before it even closes. And that's been something we were able to do even when the market wasn't as strong.
Right.
We had techniques and things in order to do that. And now that it's strong, it's a no-brainer.
Right. And the other thing that's changed in the ever-changing rental market is the Ontario government has set a new policy, because landlords were creating their own leases and they were creating things that were pretty tough. There was fine print in there that the tenants maybe didn't know about. Still within the law, but still maybe
A little stricter.
strict. And so they decided that you must only use the Ontario lease. It's a standard form. You can get it online. You can download it as a fillable form or just a PDF that you handwrite in. So whether you're using a real estate agent to find a tenant or you're doing it yourself, it's mandatory. And if you're a tenant, it's mandatory that this standard form is used. Now, what?
Not right now.
Yes, it is.
Already or
Already.
in October?
Yeah, no, it was like April of this year. But what not everyone understands is you can attach a schedule to that lease. Now, you can't contract outside of the law, and you can still put some more stipulations in there. One of the things we like to talk about is the law is changing around marijuana. And some tenants think, well, if I have a prescription for marijuana, I should be allowed to smoke in my unit, my rental unit. That's not a given.
Or, we're allowed to grow a certain number of plants, so I should be able to grow my plants in my house.
Not if you're a tenant. If it's been put in the lease
that you can't.
And the reason is that type of plant requires higher moisture, higher heat, more light. So you're going to be burning more energy, and there's more opportunity for mold to grow in the person's home, even if it's only, I think the law is 3 plants or 2 plants? I don't know. I haven't checked it because I'm not going to grow any. But it's harder on the house. So you can put a clause in your Schedule A to your lease that they may not smoke in the property, that they may not smoke marijuana in the property, that they may not grow marijuana on the property, and that way protect your investment.
Yeah. And back in the day, you could always put no smoking, but it wasn't really enforceable. And based on the new rules, it sounds like it is enforceable.
Yeah, the standard lease has a checkbox, smoking allowed or smoking not allowed. And you can, as a landlord, if the tenant does smoke in your property, you can't really interfere with their quiet enjoyment. And I love that word, quiet enjoyment, because people think, well, that means you can't be noisy on the outside or, bother their noise level. It's not about that. It's about quiet enjoyment means not being interfered with. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go and service the furnace, once or twice a year, or check the smoke alarms once a year. But you can't be going to the property every week or every couple of days and bothering the enjoyment of your tenant. That's what quiet enjoyment means. So you can put some laws in. Same thing with pets.
Clauses.
Pets, not laws. Clauses. Thank you. Pets are tougher. You can stipulate no pets or pet-free home. And a lot of tenants now ask, is this a pet-friendly house? Because they know they get turned down frequently, depending on the type of pet. Now, if they say they don't have any pets, they move in and they get a pet, what can the landlord do?
So usually, nothing.
Nothing. Exactly.
They can do nothing.
They can do nothing. Now, the exception to that is condominiums, many condominiums have a size limit or a breed limit of dogs or that kind of thing, or a quantity limit. And if the condominium has in their condominium rules and regs a limit on the number of pets or the type of pets, then that's enforceable because it's not part of the
lease.
tenant.
It's part of the condominium agreement.
So you can put those rules right into your lease and reference that it's a condominium rule, and the tenant must apply to that, or they can be evicted.
Right. And I was actually in a condo the other day that had no smoking at all inside the building of any kind, in any unit. It doesn't matter. You cannot smoke in that building. And that's part of the condo covenants. And so that's a little more strong than if it's in a lease. Like you just can't.
Yeah. And I think it's important because I don't know if you've ever walked through apartment buildings where people are renting, like if it's an apartment building, even if they have kind of their own airflow or whatever, it seems like you can smell the cooking, you can smell if someone's smoking in their unit, in the hallway.
Sometimes.
These scents will move, right? And having smelt marijuana before, it's a pretty pungent smell, and it sticks to things. So as a landlord, you really don't want someone doing that in your unit.
And then another thing that with pets, I'm going to jump back a little bit.
Okay.
You can't carry a deposit. You're not allowed to do that. Saying, hey, well, you're allowed last month's deposit, but you're not allowed more than that.
No damage deposit.
No damage
because the last
deposit.
months get used up in the last month,
so
unfortunately.
It's gone. However, you can put in your lease saying that if there is damages, that it'll be paid for by the tenant after they move out or upon whatever leaving. And so what you do to ensure that that's okay is you go through the unit with your tenant, or your manager goes through it with the tenant, and they take photos of any current damage that the tenant sees. So you say, what do you see? How does this look? Let's take pictures of it. And then when they move out, you go through it with them and say, hey, there's damage here, here, here. We look back at the photos. That damage was not there. And so you're going to need to remediate this or pay for it.
Yep.
And there's nothing you can do necessarily to hold capital, but you can definitely go to small claims court, or most tenants in my case have been really great and they're willing to honor their word. Yeah,
because sometimes, I've been in houses where you see where the cat pulled the carpet up by the door or whatever, or, they've stained it, or that kind of thing. Dogs premature and scratching hardwood and that kind of thing. Now, there are ways of putting rubber boots on dogs or clipping nails so that they don't scratch the hardwood. But if you have a dog and you're a tenant, you may want to find a property that's got laminate flooring that's more durable against that kind of scratching.
Well, and I had a house I was in actually yesterday for sale, and she's like, I have 3 dogs, they're very hyper. And I was like, oh no, the flooring's going to be destroyed. And I went in, and she had these lovely little mats all over for the dogs on the hardwood. And I lifted them up, and there's no scratching on her hardwood at all, because the dogs have traction on the mats, and they're not slipping on the part that is exposed. And so it's beautiful. It's like she doesn't have dogs. And so you can protect it from your dogs by, like you said, clipping nails or putting mats where you know that they're going to run and try and accelerate.
Yep. No, you could even put in a lease, I believe, that if they're going to put a pet in there, that the ducting will be cleaned by the landlord after, and it's a certain amount of money to do that or whatever, because they do give off dander, they give off hair, and it gets in the ductwork, and so that can be an issue for your next tenant who maybe has allergies.
Yeah, or sensitive to dander. And yeah.
Okay, what other changes in the market?
I want to just slide, because we said how to thrive in an ever-changing rental market.
Yes.
Right? And so one of the things you should be doing as a landlord or someone who's wanting to get in is knowing where to look. Knowing where to research. Oh, how do you find these changes? Where do you find the forms?
Okay.
Where do you find, this new lease? Where is it?
So if you Google, Dr. Google is awesome. If you Google Rental Tribunal Ontario, you'll find an Ontario website. The lease is there. If you type in Ontario lease, you may find some ads for different companies that want to sell you something. Don't click on those. You'll see the one that says .org, .org or something like that. And that website is the government website, and you'll get the actual forms there. That's where you get the forms if you're going to evict a tenant, if the tenant wants to leave, if you're going to increase the rent, if you're going to use the property for your own personal use or family members' use. Those forms are available there. They're downloadable. Fill them out. Now, the other change is you didn't used to have to register them with the tribunal. Now, if you give a form to your tenant, you must also register a copy with the rental tribunal, because then if there's ever a conflict, the tenant doesn't agree or you don't agree with the tenant, and you go to the tribunal, if you haven't registered it, they just void it and you have to start all over. All the time frames start right from scratch. So know the policies and the way it has to be done, and you'll be protected. If you stay and ignore those policies, then the tenant will have excess rights over top of the landlord that really you don't want them to have. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing is, if it's great to research it. If you're thinking of renting a property, if you've got an investment property, or you're thinking of buying an investment property, this is something that we love, we thrive on, we enjoy helping investors, helping landlords, even helping tenants sometimes. But generally, we help our investors find tenants, and then we vet them. In other words, we do the credit check. We'll explain what a credit check means, what the R1s are, R2s, R3s, R4s, and the different letters and numbers on a credit bureau that, if you've never seen one, might really confuse you. And it's fairly simple to explain as we go along and walk you through that process. That's the biggest thing. People build wealth. I've never heard of, sometimes you hear the horror story where somebody's rented and that tenant's damaged their property or not paid or whatever. It's happened to me once in a while. And people go, oh, poor you, poor landlord. But if someone comes to you, Ryan, and they said, oh, I've got 12 apartments that I rent out, are you going to go, poor landlord, or are you going to say, wow, that guy or that gal's building wealth like crazy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so even in the Bible says, if we are to be lenders, we're to be not borrowers, we're to be the people that own the land. So give us a call if you'd like us to walk you through that process. We'd love to do that. Whether you end up buying or not is irrelevant, because we know that as we serve, we'll be looked after. So give us a call at 613-860-4663.